Now that you know about the cardiac conduction system and how it stimulates the heart to beat, let's look at regulating the heartbeat. So remember, the heart is autorhythmic. It stimulates itself to beat, but the brain can regulate it. It can tell it to go faster or slower. And if you think back to chapter 13, when we learned about the parts of the brain, the medulla oblongata is in charge of this. So it's going to regulate your heartbeat. It has two different parts here that regulate the heartbeat. You have the cardioacceleratory center, and if you remember to chapter 15, it's the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, that are going to do this. So the cardioacceleratory center is going to give sympathetic stimulation to your heart. Then you also have the cardioinhibitory center. This gives parasympathetic stimulation to your heart. So let's look at these. If we do the sympathetic, remember this structure here from chapter 14? That is the sympathetic trunk. So anytime you see the sympathetic trunk, you know you're dealing with sympathetic stimulation. So this is our sympathetic nerve. And if we follow this sympathetic nerve, we get down here to the heart. Let's follow where it branches. It has a branch here to the SA node, has a branch here to the AV node, and it has branches that come down here to the ventricles. So for sympathetic, you're going to secrete norepinephrine onto the nodes, and this will increase your heart rate. When you put norepinephrine on the nodes, they're going to signal faster and your heart is going to beat faster. It's also putting norepinephrine onto your ventricles. And notice it's not there where the Purkinje fibers are. It's out on the muscle. This makes the muscle contract harder. So think back to chapter 15. Sympathetic causes the heart to beat faster and with more force. So the norepinephrine on the ventricles will make the muscle contract with more force. That's why when you're having an adrenaline rush, you can feel your heart pounding in your chest because you're getting more force out of those ventricles. If we look at the sympathetic is coming down right here. This is the vagus nerve. So for parasympathetic, we're going to use the vagus. So remember chapter 13 when you learned all the cranial nerves and you learned the vagus nerve? So the vagus nerve secretes acetylcholine onto the node. And when you put acetylcholine on the node, that slows the heart rate. Think back to chapter 15. Look at your chapter 15 lab if you have it handy. For parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, it decreases rate only. Notice that the vagus nerve does not go down to the ventricles, so it has no effect on force. So sympathetic increases rate and force, parasympathetic decreases rate. So your medulla oblongata is regulating your heart. and it's constantly deciding if it wants to use its cardioacceleratory center and use sympathetic to secrete norepinephrine and increase the rate and force, or if it wants to use the cardioinhibitory center to have the vagus nerve secrete acetylcholine and decrease the rate. So in order to make this decision, your medulla oblongata needs information. So let's think about what kind of information it would base this decision on. Think back now to Chapter 1, when we did that Chapter 1 lab. So go way back in your mind to the very first lab you ever did in anatomy and physiology. You had 2 beakers of bromethyl blue, and you had a straw, and you blew bubbles into the first one until it turned yellow. Then you went and ran around up and down the stairs or up and down the hall. You got some exercise. And then you blew bubbles again into the second one and timed how long it turned until it turned yellow. The point of that was to compare how much carbon dioxide you're exhaling when you're resting or you're exercising. Now think about why carbon dioxide is so important. Think back to Chapter 3 when we learned about cellular respiration. Every time your cells make ATP, they put carbon dioxide into your blood. What happens when the CO2 gets into your blood? Go back to your Chapter 3 notes. It mixes with the water in your blood and forms carbonic acid. Now think back to Chapter 2 when you learned about pH and acids and bases. If you form acid, this will reduce your pH. Now also think back to early last semester. You have to keep your blood pH at 7.4. This is what your medulla oblongata is concerned with, keeping your blood pH at 7.4. So it has receptors. You have up here in the medulla oblongata is your central chemoreceptor. This monitors the pH of your cerebral spinal fluid. So remember, cerebral spinal fluid, that's the fluid that's made from the blood and it flows through the brain and the spine. And the pH of this is very important also. You also want to keep it at 7.4. And the pH of this also depends on carbon dioxide level. So your medulla oblongata has a central chemoreceptor that's monitoring the pH of your cerebral spinal fluid. Then you also have peripheral chemoreceptors. Here in your carotids, and here in your aorta. So here you have the peripheral chemoreceptors. They monitor the pH of your blood, the carbon dioxide level of your blood, and they respond to very low oxygen of your blood. Now, it's the pH and the carbon dioxide that we're most concerned with. It's only if your oxygen drops very low that they're going to respond to that. In a healthy person in normal circumstances, your oxygen is not going to drop low enough to stimulate these receptors. So we're not going to worry about those for now. You also have in your peripheral, the carotids and the aorta, you have baroreceptors. These detect how much your arteries are stretching. And the higher your blood pressure, the more your arteries stretch. So now we can look at all the information the medulla oblongata is receiving. You have central chemoreceptor telling it the pH of cerebrospinal fluid. You have peripheral chemoreceptors telling it the pH of blood and how much carbon dioxide is in the blood. And you have peripheral baroreceptors telling it what your blood pressure is. So now the medulla oblongata has to use this information and decide if it wants to send sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulation to the heart. So let's walk through the logic here of how it makes this decision. If we use sympathetic, sympathetic is going to increase your heart rate and your force. This means you will send more blood through your lungs. If you're sending more blood through your lungs, you are going to remove more carbon dioxide. So think about what kind of situation would cause you to want to remove more carbon dioxide. The stimulus and the result have to match up to each other. Your result is that you remove more carbon dioxide. Well, what does that do to pH? Remember, carbon dioxide forms acid in your blood, which lowers pH. If you take away the carbon dioxide, it's not there to form the acid, which means that you increase the pH. Well, if you're wanting to increase your pH, that means there's something going on in your body that's lowering it. Remember, you always want to stay at homeostasis. Your goal is to stay at 7.4. So you would do this if your pH is too low. So if your pH is too low, your medulla oblongata would use sympathetic to increase your heart rate and force. You'll send more blood through your lungs, you'll get rid of carbon dioxide, and you'll bring your pH back up. And this way, you'll stay at 7.4. So think about it. This is when you're active. If you are active, your cells are making more ATP. And if they're making more ATP, they are putting more carbon dioxide into your blood. And if they're putting more carbon dioxide into your blood, that's making more acid and lowering your pH. So those chemoreceptors detect this. They tell your medulla oblongata, it says, hey, I better use the cardioacceleratory center, have sympathetic, send some norepinephrine down there, get the heart going a little more, get rid of this extra carbon dioxide, bring the pH back to 7.4. This would also be with the baroreceptors. Remember, they detect your blood pressure. If they detect that blood pressure is too low, because if you increase your heart rate and increase the force, that will increase your blood pressure and counteract the pressure being too low. Then let's look at parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is going to decrease your heart rate. If you decrease your heart rate, you will send less blood through your lungs. If you send less blood through your lungs, you are going to retain carbon dioxide. And if you retain carbon dioxide, there's going to be more of it there, making acid, which is going to lower your pH. So remember, the results have to match the stimulus. What would cause your medulla oblongata to decide to do this? Well, it would decide to do this if your pH is going up too high. So when you are resting, your cells only make a little bit of ATP. Which means that they're not putting very much carbon dioxide into your blood, so you have low CO2 entering their blood. So there's not very much there to make the acid. So therefore you want to take less out. If less is going in, you want less coming out. You always want to make sure your overall goal is to always have the CO2 in equal to the CO2 out. If whatever goes in equals what comes out, then you will stay at 7.4. So that's why when you're resting, you slow your heart rate. This would also be if the baroreceptors are detecting that blood pressure is too high. Then they could tell your medulla oblongata that your arteries are being stretched too much. Your medulla oblongata will have the vagus nerve secrete acetylcholine onto the node, slow the heart rate down, and if you slow the heart down, blood pressure comes down. So take some time to really review this information. Go back and review the old chapters that this relates to. Make sure this makes sense. You might even want to re-watch this part. Make sure that this makes sense before you go on to the next parts.